Pamela Garfield-Jaeger is a licensed clinical social worker with over 20 years of experience. She has worked in a variety of settings, including New York community-based agencies, residential programs for foster youth, schools, and mental health clinics in California. She has been a clinical supervisor for up-and-coming therapists for 10 years. In 2017, she had to leave her profession due to a severe disability, and when she returned, so much of the mental health profession had changed, particularly when it comes to treatment of gender dysphoric patients. In the teen clinic she was at in San Mateo County, California, in 2021, 3 out of 10 kids identified as non-binary, and none of her colleagues questioned it. Since she was working with vulnerable youth for over 20 years, there had been a drastic change. There were other negative trends happening, such as reinforcement of victim mentality and boys being dismissed as having toxic masculinity. During our interview, we talk about why therapists can have blind spots too, and ways Pamela is working to help people find good support for their mental health. We also reflect on the mass formation of 2 sects of scientism, the response to COVID, and the response to gender dysphoria. She offers advice for those struggling to forgive mistreatment and how to navigate tensions between family members while setting healthy boundaries. We consider what happens when someone's way of life drives coercive policymaking. And in a country founded on religious freedom and individual liberties, what could happen when one set of values tramples on your own? With part 1 of our conversation, I'm Sienna Mae Heath, and this is Leaving the Left for Liberty. Well, Pamela, it's great to see you and to talk to you again. As you know, I am quite familiar with your journey, your personal journey of getting red-pilled, and much of your content as the Truthful Therapist on Instagram. And I love what you're doing. I feel like we connected at just the right time. And here today, I'm setting the intention to give you the space to share your personal experience and also your perspective as a therapist and a social worker with regard to the COVID response and gender identity theory, particularly how it's affecting children within the field of psychology. So there's a lot to dive into. And given how much we've spoken before, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I feel honored to be on this podcast, and I'm really glad I've gotten to know you already so much. So
yeah, likewise. And we will be seeing each other next week when you're on the East Coast.
I'm so excited.
Yeah. I know that you worked in San Mateo, California. Where are you located in California now?
So I live in Pacifica, California, which is about 15 minutes south of San Francisco. It's a coastal town, and it's still considered Silicon Valley in the Bay Area of California.
Oh, cool.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's beautiful. It's a very beautiful spot. So
yeah, I've always wanted to get out there, maybe one day.
Yeah.
Well, since much of your content is helpful to parents concerned about their children, I'm curious, back when you were working like in 2016 and you ended up being on disability, what were you noticing back then? Like, were you noticing an uptick in trans identifying children then, or was it more something that evolved later on?
So, I did not notice it quite as much. There was a little bit, but I didn't notice it. Actually, in 2016, I just started a new job at UCSF. But just before that, I was working for many years at schools. So I was working at Gunn High School in 2015, which is just a year before. I've been working there for several years. And it was not a big thing there at all. Some of the gender ideology was starting. I remember kids talking about being pansexual a little bit. The pronouns were just starting to become, fashionable or just starting to be talked about, but not something everybody was doing. There was one person who was transgender in the school, that I remember the school struggling with and not thinking there was a one size fits all for this person. It was actually a girl who identified as a boy. And it seemed, at least at the time, not someone who was just looking for attention, which I think many of the kids are doing now. It didn't seem like it was, so it didn't seem like it was following a trend because this was the only person doing it. So it had a different tone to it. So just one person, and this is in Palo Alto, California, which is possibly one of the most liberal schools in the entire country, right across from Stanford. And so it wasn't an issue then. And then I actually started a job after that. I was working a little bit with the elderly, so not there. And then I started working at UCSF, and that was with adults, and that was not even a topic at all with the adults. It wasn't anything I even thought about at the time.
Okay.
In terms of gender. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for grounding us in that time with regard to your career. And I'd also like to get a little bit personal and ask you, like, what was it like to experience being on disability back then? Like what brought you to that place in your life, and what was it like for you then? Like, because it was such a polarizing time in our country, fall 2016, and it was an eye-opening time for you in a lot of ways. So where had you been working where you were put on disability, and what was that time like for you?
So yeah, this was 2016. I was working at UCSF. I had just gotten a new job that year, and that, to me, I thought it was my life was beginning. I finally got a job with great benefits and a really great salary. And, I was actually a little overqualified for that job because I'd been a supervisor for so many years, but it was just a job where I was just doing direct clinical work. But it was with adults in a IOP PHP program, which means it's group therapy for adults who are transitioning mostly from a hospital setting or inpatient setting to an outpatient setting. And I was doing the group therapy and case management there. And I thought it was going to be the best thing. But then I did come down with this rare disorder. I didn't know what it was. It took me about 1.5 years to figure it out because the doctors didn't know what it was. And many of them didn't believe me that I was having this severe pain. It turns out it was probably from a lot of things, but it was triggered by the bad desk that UCSF had given me. It was an ergonomic issue. And I spiraled into this terrible disability where I basically had to drop out at the end of 2017. And so what was it like then? Interesting. So I was working at UCSF when Trump was elected. I remember that day pretty clearly, actually. And I'll be honest, I didn't vote for him. I was a Democrat at the time, a lifelong Democrat. And I honestly wasn't very political at all. I would probably call myself a low information voter at the time, not someone that really paid attention to a lot of things. I just thought Trump was stupid, and I didn't hate him. I just thought he was stupid. I did buy into a little bit of that whole grab him by the pussy campaign and didn't want that as my president. I bought the propaganda. But I didn't think he was Hitler or fascist or I don't know, any of these things that people were thinking. I wasn't one of those liberals that, cried that day or, wailed or, all those famous images that we're still seeing today. However, at UCSF, my colleagues who were very left leaning, they all gathered. We were sharing an office. They all gathered in my office, by their desk. It was one woman's desk, actually. And they were looking in the morning at the election results, and they just sat there and they cried. I mean, cried tears, wailed. They were crying in the office, crying hard that Trump had been elected. And I remember thinking to myself, "You guys are idiots."
Even then, wow.
Even then, I remember losing respect for them, the way they were behaving, and I was what I believe was on their side. I didn't vote for Trump myself, but I just thought that was an overreaction. And that was the tone just even then.
Yeah, perhaps even in a professional setting, that's where you would hope people would have some containment around their emotions. But, in the field of therapy, maybe it's different. Maybe it's a different work culture.
I guess. And at one point I was crying because I was in such severe pain that I couldn't function. It was really, really severe. And I ended up crying. And then I apologized and was embarrassed for crying. And then my colleague said, "That's okay. We cried about Trump. You can cry." And I felt so invalidated. Like, really?
Ooh.
So you're comparing, you're crying about Trump being elected to the fact that I'm about to drop out onto disability and give up this job that I finally found that's going to, pay me a good salary and give me great benefits. And I don't know what's going to happen next. And doctors don't believe me and no one understands what's going on. And you're going to compare that to Donald Trump was elected. That was, yeah, I realized looking back, these were my first clues to maybe I'm not, on the same page as a lot of the people I thought I was. So that was,
Wow,
yeah.
that really strikes a nerve, because many folks on the left will bring up Trump's comments about people with disabilities and his
Yeah.
mockery of them in part. And so like many of these people seem very self-righteous and defending people and advocating for people who are in various levels of pain or disability. And yet here they were with you, completely invalidating your experience.
I mean, they didn't know what was going on. It was invisible. They couldn't see, but I was in so much pain. And I mean, you could see if you were paying attention, but you can't physically see. I had severe nerve pain was what was going on. Basically, my nerves were being pinched between my collarbone and my first rib. And so I wasn't able to function. And so, but it's nobody, I didn't know that. I didn't understand that at the time, and nobody did. But they were very insensitive. I've never actually been around a group of therapists that were as insensitive as those therapists at UCSF. I don't know what that was about. Most therapists are a lot nicer. They're not always so smart about politics, but they are usually a lot nicer than that.
Yeah, I would hope so. Gosh. It's like I'm just envisioning like the waitress who's like Pollyanna on the floor in public, and then she goes back in the kitchen and it's just a completely different character.
Yeah.
With a fiery temper. But I would hope that that's not the case with therapists.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, some of the things they said behind the scenes were interesting. I could tell you one little vignette. Again, I was a Democrat, and I remember they did a little icebreaker in the groups, and there was this man who was a vet who had come back from Afghanistan with a brain injury. He obviously been through a lot, has trauma, physical and emotional trauma being in this program. And they did a little icebreaker asking, "Who is your hero?" And his answer was Ronald Reagan. And not to his face, but behind the scenes, when we were reviewing what they said in the groups, they were making fun of him. And I didn't like that at all. I couldn't believe that. I was like, what? And I got to be honest, I wasn't very politically savvy to even know why Ronald Reagan could be good or bad. I don't know. It's embarrassing to tell you how ignorant I was politically. But regardless, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you think. You should be respectful of what your clients say. And I was shocked at that.
Right. And this actually brings to mind, it's something I wanted to bring up later, but I think I'd rather like discuss it now. What makes a good therapist, and what is the therapist's purpose? Because I feel like, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like in a situation where, say, a client says like, I'm a big fan of Ronald Reagan, or perhaps brings up an even more controversial political view, and for some reason this is tied up in their belief system and their struggles. Now, would it be the therapist's role then to help the client understand why they believe as they do, why they feel as they do, rather than try to change how they believe or feel?
Definitely. Yeah, it's about a therapist's role is to help the person make the best choices for that person. It's not about what the therapist believes. It's about what's best for that person. It's so funny how therapists, or I guess people on the left, whatever, they're all about having cultural competence. What real cultural competence is actually listening to a person and hearing their point of view and not imposing your own views on that person. And what I just described was exactly the opposite. So I think a good therapist, and it's really not easy if you're doing it genuinely, but it's something to always strive for, is to really try to be present with that person and to help them make the best choices for them and help them live within their value system. right? So
Yeah. And I know that your beliefs evolved even before 2020. We've talked about how through your personal experience of being on disability, and having like your interpersonal relationships with, perhaps with family and also with your colleagues evolve over time. How did your beliefs evolve as a result of that experience?
so of my red pilling,
Well, I mean, I want to transition from like 2016, 2017, 18, 19, and then kind of get a sense of like where you were in that space within
so
your belief
during
system. Yeah.
I gotta be honest. So during those years, I think this is why I'm a little bit of an interesting case, is because I was kind of underground dealing with such severe pain in survival mode, basically spending most of my days in bed or just going for a walk and then going back to bed or going to a doctor's office. And that was the most I could handle for the day. So all of these things that probably you and most of the country were going through in terms of watching your relationships split and divide because of these politics and these, all these divisions, I wasn't experiencing that. I lost a lot of friends just because I had thought there were people that were going to be there for me for my, to be there for my health issues, but they'd rather go to a pussy march. And that was one of the moments that really showed me who some of my friends were. And they didn't know what was going on, nor did they listen to me. And they thought I was being ignorant or not caring about the world because I didn't go wear the pussy hat that day. And so those are little things that gave me clues, but I really was honestly just surviving. I was really in so much pain. I couldn't even tie my shoes on certain days. I remember handing my phone over to my husband and saying, "Can you just text this person back?" I couldn't even hold the phone. I didn't have use of my hands. I couldn't sit up. I mean, holding my head up, my neck hurt so badly because the weight of my head was too heavy for it. And it was really extreme at a certain point. So I wasn't really a part of this whole polarization that happened in the country. I didn't realize I was supposed to hate Trump so much and have this sort of Trump derangement syndrome as a Democrat. I didn't learn that. I wasn't paying attention to any of it. So that's why I had a different podcast. I called myself the Rip Van therapist. Because I was kind of asleep. I was under a rock, really. I was under a pain rock. I don't know how else to put it. I was dealing with this health system that wasn't listening to me. I was completely stressed out. I didn't know what was going on. It was really scary. I had doctors telling me that I was just faking it and I was just trying to avoid life, when I had just the year before done triathlons and I was a swimmer and have done Alcatraz, swam from Alcatraz 5 times, but suddenly I'm avoiding life and I just want to be in bed and that's the way I want it. That's what doctors were implying to me. And it was a terrible experience. So I really wasn't thinking about politics or what Trump was doing, or I don't even, all that stuff. I mean, I remember seeing a lot of it from the sidelines. I remember when they were trying to say, Trump was putting kids in cages, and I learned that was fake. But I really wasn't paying attention to most of the riffraff that was going on. So I wasn't in that game, I guess.
And because you weren't invested in it like some of your peers were, I think that this lent you a sense of objectivity. Because when you did peek your head out, you weren't, I mean, perhaps you need to get informed in certain ways, but you also weren't so consumed by Trump derangement syndrome, among other, perhaps, I mean, not to downplay it, but like among other like mental struggles that many people were going through on both sides. And moving into 2020, what was your red pill moment?
So yeah, and just back to that, I was I was so naive. I thought people were open to conversations. Like I didn't get it. So that's where I was. I thought people were normal, and like if you had an idea, you could talk about it, and maybe you could disagree or agree or hear what they have to say, and they'd hear what I have to say, and we just have an open dialogue. That's how in the dark I was about how the world was going or how country was going. So this was my big red pill. So in 2020. When George Floyd died, I just didn't understand how I agreed that it was a horrific, obviously it was a horrific situation. It was very sensationalized by the media. Nobody thought that was a good thing, but I just didn't understand how that really bad thing connected to the idea that our entire country is racist and we need to dismantle, all of our systems and defund the police. I just was really surprised that everyday people thought defunding the police was a good idea. And then seeing all these riots happening and, all the mayhem, and then having it being excused for all of that was what red pilled me. So I was just surprised that I thought, oh, I could talk about it and be like, you guys, well, what about this or that? And thought I would have people just have a reasonable conversation. And then people who I knew for my whole life, who I actually went to sleepaway camp as a child, childhood friends, were shunning me as racist and said I was white-splaining when I told them how I was a social worker that, really connected with a lot of Black families in Harlem and the Bronx, and kind of felt like I had some connection with some of the things they go through. And I didn't think that this would help, because I know how much crime that their neighborhoods go through and that they need the police and things like that. And they just thought I was, they said I was white-splaining. They said I was racist. I don't know if I was actually called a white supremacist yet at that point. I don't remember all the words, but that was really shocking to me, and probably wouldn't have been shocking to anybody else who hadn't been going through all the disability, because I wasn't interacting with people on these topics before. So,
well,
yeah.
To be honest, it was shocking to me too. I didn't live under maybe the heaviest rock, but I was shocked at the lack of interest in discourse and in storytelling. And I get the sense that being a social worker, working in social work and therapy, that a lot of your work is based in storytelling and belief systems. And so to step out in summer 2020 and have not only like just some of your friends and family, but also your colleagues, all of a sudden, like, it seemed like they were betraying their own values by playing into this mayhem.
I just felt like I was in the Twilight Zone. I really felt like I was in the Twilight Zone when all the black squares were happening, when they started painting the basketball court with the big yellow letters, and Kamala Harris was, getting people, bailing all these criminals out of jail for destroying and looting and setting fires. And people were saying this is all just fine and it's all in the name of justice. I just was like, what are we doing? You guys?
Yeah, it was really wild. Yeah. And
so I was in this running club at the time. I finally got back. This is funny. So that was June of 2020. I just gotten back from, and I still had pain. I had this terrible recovery from the surgery in November of 2019. And I finally got back. I ran my very first 5K in January, and I joined this running club. And it was a really big deal for me to be a part of anything at all and seeing human beings and be active and moving. And they actually named me runner of the month because, and it was really nice. And then so I was connecting with them because I'm that kind of person. I like to be in clubs and be a part of things, right? Especially athletics, because that's who I am and that's what I like to do. And my running club put out a big statement about how they support Black Lives Matter on their social media. And little naive me just thought, oh, they just don't know all the things that they have on their website. They think it's a nice thing because everybody thinks Black Lives Matter, of course, but do they know it's about dismantling families? Do they know it's about defunding the police? Do they know that they're supporting this destruction and riots, and that's what they're about? So I sent them this long, very earnest message thinking that they would hear me out. And they just said, nope, we stand by what we said. And they didn't listen to me. And I haven't run with them since. And that was a loss. It was a really big loss.
Yeah, I imagine so.
That was the beginning of my grief,
Of grieving the old world, old systems, old friends. Yeah. Yeah. And how did this awakening inform your stance on the connection between critical race theory and mental health?
Yeah, so what happened was, once that veil got unlifted, basically it lifted everything. I was just like, well, wait a second. Wait, so you mean to say that the welfare state is actually something that's really done more harm than good. I hadn't thought about that. Wait, do you mean to say that really what we need is to focus on families being together in the household, and that the families that have single parent households are the ones that do it the worst, and it's not really about race? Whoa. Mind blown, and then it made sense to me, honestly, from a experience point of view, because that's what I saw, right, in my clinical work, but I just hadn't put the political pieces together. And so, yeah, how did it inform my work? Yeah, it just informed me of so many things. And then we'll get to this, but then that's when I started to think about the gender stuff. I really never thought about it as an agenda or a problem. I actually thought it was all nice and about tolerance. And I really never want to make anybody feel judged or bad for being, of a different, either wanting to identify as a different gender or just having a different sexuality or a different viewpoint on, whatever, just alternative lifestyles, right? And so I'd never saw any of that stuff. And I'm like, wait a second. Now I see, now it's getting more extreme. I kind of see the seeds that they had been planting all along. And I was kind of a pawn in all of that. So
Right.
I noticed all of it. And I just noticed how, with the BLM, I noticed how it was creating more anger, more unrest, more division, more stress, more trauma. You take away police, you take away safety, you create more chaos. What does that do? That, obviously that's going to impact everyone's mental health, especially children, but everyone. You see that I have experience working with the women with, these low self-esteem, and, they're being reinforced with that they're strong women for sleeping around and not needing a man, and all these ideas that, I even kind of bought into, especially more as a young woman. Oh yeah, like I can do what I want. I'd like to watch Sex and the City. That was a cool show. I kind of lived that life. I was living in New York during that time, and I thought I was cool. And honestly, I actually do appreciate having to live, being single or whatever. But I also now recognize how some of those ideas were harmful too, and I didn't see that side. And so it just opened me up to a lot of things about how a lot of this is causing chaos for people.
Yeah,
And
it
causing
opened. Mhm. Yeah, it opened a lot of us up, and of course, as we know, this was during the pandemic. So the COVID response is something that you focus on a lot too in your content regarding mental health. And like during the pandemic, many people were going through tough times. Some might call it trauma, depending on the situation. And most of us, I think in the spring of 2020, I think probably most Americans experience social isolation, often by choice. Many of us by choice quarantined. And there was sort of a sense of being in it together, although there were plenty of.
I hated that. When they
kind
kept
of,
saying
yeah.
that, I was like, stop saying that. No, we're not.
We're not, though.
We are so not. You people, some people made fun of that online, and, they're like with the elites, like out on their estates and flying their jets. We're in it together. It's like, yeah, shut up.
Right.
No,
like they're just like painting these words in the sky. Like, okay, we're in it together. I think the wake-up call for a lot of us in June 2020 was that the left then started targeting everybody else, and not just the right, but really like everyone else who just didn't fit the ideology, didn't fit the mold. They were targeting them with canceling, with firing, with even death wishes as, the vaccines rolled out. That really
that was a whole new level.
It was a whole new level. And like, meanwhile,
didn't expect that. And see, again, so I was so naive.
I know. And like it caused divisions between family members isolated one another and shunned one another. I could go on, but really, what I want to get to, like from the angle of, I think, like science and maybe medicine, and mental health, is that like essentially if you didn't agree with that sect of scientism, you were outcasted. And I see the same thing happening with gender identity theory. Is like, oh, if you don't agree with this sect of scientism, you are also outcasted in all these same ways, really. And some, like you to some extent, risked losing your job. If you want to talk about like being laid off because of not getting the thing.
Yeah, I didn't get the thing.
That. Yeah. So
after everything I went through with my disability,
right.
I had nothing to do with politics. I had chronic nerve pain. I still do as we speak right now. I have chronic nerve pain, and I have muscle spasms in my neck, and I have nerve pain and tingling in my hands, especially on my right side, because I still have compression left from the 2 surgeries and the scar tissue in there. I cannot work a full-time job. So I just decided I just wanted to wait. I actually wasn't against it. I thought I was going to get it. I just was like, I'm going to wait a little bit and see what happens.
No, there was no waiting allowed.
I waited a little and I saw what happened, and then I said no.
Right. It just cemented my skepticism as well. And with all of this, there's been an erosion of trust. All of this, pandemic, BLM, all of the things. And as you reflect on all of this happening in a relatively short amount of time, just a couple of years, how are you managing to move forward, and what advice might you give to someone like such as a client, a prospective client who is struggling to forgive all of this mistreatment?
I wish I had that answer. I really do. I'll tell you what I've done, and I think I'm still working on it. I think it's still a work in progress. For one, I think this podcast, the fact that I'm talking to you right now, is a testament to the fact that I've reached out and connected with other like-minded people. And I think a lot of other people are doing the same. And I think that has, while a lot of bridges have been burned, a lot of new bridges have been built. And I think that's kind of a beautiful, side thing that happened, I guess, a silver lining that happened. You sent me that podcast with Brett Weinstein, and they were talking about that, those 2 men. And I was thinking about that.
Yes,
about us.
that was the episode with Brett Weinstein and Matthias Desmet.
Yes, I didn't know how to pronounce his name.
Yeah, he's the fellow who explains the phenomenon of mass formation.
Yeah, I've seen him, and that was a beautiful conversation. And they were talking about that, how while there's been all this sort of destruction and division, and I'm having personal challenges with my family. I'm talking to my family, but I do self-censor in order for us to get along, and it's painful sometimes. So there's that. And most of my former friends I don't talk to anymore. I had a lot of therapy friends, or people I worked with in the mental health field I do not talk to anymore, that I was disinvited to. I was supposed to go to a certain wedding. I was never invited. I was disinvited to a Memorial Day weekend party. This was even before the mandates rolled out, but I was told that I was actually deciding whether I should just lie and say I got the vaccine, or be honest with my friend and say I didn't get it, because she put out a shout out saying, if you haven't gotten the vaccine, you need to wear a mask at our party. And this was an outdoor party. And I said, at this point, there was data showing we didn't need to wear them. And that I decided, my husband said lie. And I said, you know what, this is my friend and I don't want to lie. And I didn't. And then I never heard from her again. And she actually said that she was afraid, and her pediatrician gave her this advice, that I can't be around her baby, that basically I would kill her baby. And that was very painful.
Yeah.
I wasn't even going to hold the baby. I'm not one of those people that coos over someone else's baby. So it's not like I was going to come up to the baby and kiss it and hold it. I would have kept my distance from the baby. I would have social distance from the baby.
Yeah.
And I still couldn't have gone.
Yeah. And I'm also really not one to like force any sort of interaction, if and even just like physically, I don't want to like get too close, but back then, like I wouldn't want to like get too close to someone, more than 6 feet, if they didn't consent to it. So I can understand to some degree, but I think because of all the persecution that was happening,
that was when it was starting.
Yeah. And like that was, so it was right around that time where like there was the added anxiety of, well, like, are my friends not even going to address this? I actually have a quote behind me from Martin Luther King. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Mm-hmm. And for me, then and now, it's actually the silence that's the most unnerving.
I was shocked at that individual, actually, because she and I worked together at this pretty chaotic agency in San Francisco, and she spoke out against a lot of the things that were happening. It was a program that actually kind of modeled a lot of socialistic values. It's basically everybody pools their Medicaid, Medi-Cal dollars, and then what happened was the squeaky wheel patients would get all the treatments, and then the people that wouldn't speak wouldn't get what they needed. And she hated that, and she spoke out against it. And she was honestly very, very smart and very outspoken about a lot of things that were not popular. And so I was really shocked that she went along. She believed in all the COVID, propaganda. So it was there's this disappointment and shock and, again, grief. So
absolutely. Yeah. And I'd like to tie some of this back into the phenomenon of gender dysphoria, or rather the condition of gender dysphoria. The symptoms of scientism during the pandemic seem eerily similar to yet another sect of scientism, which is now promoting gender identity theory in practice. So I had Kat Kattinson on, and she was the one that she likes to say gender identity theory rather than gender ideology. And I think that for some reason holds more weight and more meaning, because it is a theory after all. It's not fact. It's not, it's only just recently being put into practice. This is a social experiment.
Very much.
Yeah. So what similarities have you been observing between the two sects of scientism, the sect of COVID response and the sect of gender identity theory? Is there anything that sets them apart?
Well, first of all, science has been bastardized completely at this point. I don't know how we can come back to that. You say the word science, and it doesn't mean anything. I mean, Fauci is the science, right? I don't know, that doesn't even mean anything. They've used the word science as a weapon so often now that it means nothing. So there's that. So it's really frustrating when you are looking at real science, or you're at least trying to, and you can't trust anything anymore. That's a whole other topic. I think we were talking about trust. We'll get into that later. But how do they connect? I mean, I think the biggest similarity is I just believe there's a lot of propaganda, and the propaganda is what guides people to believe what they're doing or what they believe in general, and what they believe in is the right thing. And what the propaganda tells them, and this is what's being used as a weapon, is basically, if you don't believe what we're saying in these things, then you're a very bad person in some shape or form. You're a Nazi, you're a transphobe, you're a bigot, you're a science denier, you're a flat earther, I don't know, pick your insults. And so if you're questioning what they're saying, these platitudes that really are, if you think for 2 seconds, they don't actually make any sense. I mean, we all know that the masks don't work. If they worked, COVID would be gone by now, because we're all wearing the masks for 2+ years. And all these people who are getting sick, I mean, right now as we speak, Jill Biden has COVID. And if she was wearing her mask so well as she told us all to, she wouldn't have COVID. And she knew her husband was sick. Our president got COVID, and he wore the mask alone in his office. I think he's still doing it. So I don't know. The point is that if they tell you, if you do this thing and this authority tells you to do this thing, and if you don't believe this authority, you're a bad person. And so they use that as a weapon. And if you go outside those lines, you have to tolerate being told that you're a bad person. And we're getting more used to it. I think, like you and I are getting more used to it. That's why there are these podcasts out there, but it's not easy. And I think there's a lot of people that still aren't able to do that, or maybe they're just not, they don't have the insight. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think they use that, it's weaponized, these messages, because we all want to know and believe we're good people inside. And I mean, I don't know, we can get into human nature things. We're going to talk about that later.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, we definitely will.
But I think as individuals, we at least we want to try our best, and we want to believe that we're good people. And I think for the most part, while people collectively don't always do the right thing, I think most people want to, and most people are not sociopaths, and they're not trying to mutilate children. I think that they're just believing these messages that if you don't do this, then is this going to really harm this child? She's going to kill herself. And that's a scary notion. I'm a good person. I don't want anybody to be in this kind of distress. I want to help kids, and I don't want them to feel bad about themselves, feel ashamed. So of course I'm going to accept trans kids, you know? So I think that's the similarity, is how they weaponize this feeling that I'm a good person, so I will go along with what you're saying.
Absolutely.
I see that the most.
Yeah. Yeah. And through this bloom of identity politics, one thing I've noticed is that people who are identifying with the LGB, part of the LGBTQ plus community, quote unquote, people who have called themselves allies as well, like they're breaking off because they're feeling ostracized. They can see that this is nonsensical and damaging to their mental health, and they can't take it anymore. And the LGB part, lesbians, gays, bisexuals, they're leaving what is supposed to be their community. And this group of people the group of people who are part of the alleged community, who don't invite diversity of thought, even amongst their alleged members, are just like, they're spinning their wheels. I can't even imagine what it's like to be them. But is calling this a community a form of gaslighting?
Yes, for sure. It's not a community. None of these communities are communities. I mean, you could translate that to all of the different identity politics. I mean, I've heard a lot of Black people say this. I actually just read a really good book. I'm going to do a little shout out. His name is Adam Coleman, and he wrote this book called From Victim to Victor, and it's really great. And I mean, he talked about a lot of things in detail, and he shared his personal experience, but basically a lot of his message is, we're not a monolith. Black people are not a monolith. LGBTQ plus IA, blah, blah, blah. They're not a monolith. I've talked to a lot of transgender people online because of the things I've been posting, and they don't agree with what's going on. They don't like that they're kind of being pulled into this. It's just the T's are not a community, you know, let alone the LGBT and all the other letters. So just the T's are not a community. So they don't like being pulled into this. They don't want to be a part of it. And then, we know I know you're aware, and most people now are aware of this big group that newly formed called Gays Against Groomers. And they are definitely not on board with all of this gender stuff. And they actually just got pulled off Twitter yesterday. I mean, they just got taken down, which is unbelievable, in that Twitter would censor them that way. And there's no community. I mean, you really think about it, the United States, we're about individuals, and that's our culture. But they're trying to erase that. They're trying to divide us by these quote unquote communities, but those are not communities. Communities are people that actually really have a real connection, not superficially because of some name or some politician talks about them in some group way and tries to get them to vote for them.
I will say though that I think every group perhaps is susceptible to groupthink. And I don't want to name names or name groups, but I have seen amongst some kind of like cooler, more like rebellious T's that like they'll still identify as a man when they're a woman and as a woman when they're a man. And actually I've got the definition of a woman right here on my water bottle. This woman, an adult human female. And that's from Kelly J. Keane. She's a brilliant activist over in the UK. And she's had this put up on billboards and taken it down. And in my small city here, I've had the stickers taken down. And it's well, I don't want to say it's baffling because I think I kind of understand why. But like even those who are speaking out and saying, oh, we shouldn't be forcing this ideology on children, even some of those T's will co-opt the language of woman, or in some cases man. And that's why I've actually taken a step back. And I don't know about you, if you've noticed sort of maybe for the sake of the children, so they say, they're just like kind of going along with, okay, fine, we'll affirm you as a woman, like if you support our cause. I have seen that. I don't know if you've noticed.
Well, I think there's a difference. I think you and I don't totally align on this, and that's okay. But I will use the pronoun or whatever however you want to say it with a person who's identifying as the opposite gender. But I think that there's a sort of a social contract that we know that you're not a biological woman or man if you've not been born that way, and that they don't get, they don't get to play the sports with the women, and they don't get to do those things. But they want to live quietly as that other gender. And I do actually respect that for a very small population. So I have actually Kat, her interview with you actually did shift me to help me recognize that I think a lot more people that are living as transgender might have more things to resolve, and then they could really be okay in the body they were born in. But it's hard for me to judge whether or not that's the case. But what I do believe is that it's a very rare thing, and I believe it should not be pushed on kids or even adults. When you say to say I'm a woman when you're born a man, yeah, I don't think that's okay. But to kind of live as, I do think that's okay for a small population. So I guess we kind of disagree on that.
I guess to live as, to some extent, like you said, like, okay, they don't get to play sports with women and so forth. So it's like, where is that line? And I noticed, like, among libertarians these days, actually, when I did the interview with Kat, one of the criticisms in our audience was, oh, why are you uplifting the story? Just live and let live. Okay, but like, what is this guise of live and let live? It's one thing to live and let live and say, hey, like, I respect your right to live as you want and believe as you want. But when gender identity theory, almost by design, tramples on the individual's right to consent, and the individual's right to have perhaps religious freedom, or just the freedom to believe and speak as they want, to not have their speech coerced, to call someone something that they know is just not true, then that's where it gets tricky for me. Because yeah, I mean, ideally I want to support everyone's right to pursue happiness. That's a part of what this country is built on. But what happens when their theory and their way of life tramples on mine? And I think that's the tension that we're experiencing.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, I actually honestly, because now I've been in this little world and I see all the sides to it. And I personally think that no one should be coerced. And if you don't want to address anybody as a man or a woman, if they're not really a man or woman, I think you have every right to. And I don't think that makes you a bad or rude person. But to me personally, I'm okay with doing that. But once I'm coerced to do it, I'm not as okay, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's kind of actually where I'm at as well. But I mean, if you asked me a year or two ago, I was also like, yeah, whatever, like, I'll use your pronouns, your preferred pronouns. But because the culture has shifted so dramatically, and because it's created a culture where, I mean, even like, I know of domestic violence shelters who are affirming men as women.
I think that's wrong. I just met somebody actually that works for one of those, and she was telling me that she was I think, I don't know, she works for them. She was talking to one at least, and she was very much against that. These sexual abuse survivors. Oh yeah, they have a program for sexual abuse survivors, women who need to be escorted by another woman to, do certain errands and whatnot. And the whole program was about having a woman help a woman. And now they're suddenly allowing trans women to be the escorts, which is not okay.
Trans-identified males,
Well, yeah, basically someone who's presenting as a woman but's really a man. So even if that person honestly is very kind and sweet and really could do the job well, if someone has sexual trauma with previously with a man, and they need an actual woman there. That there is a reason why this program is set up for a woman to help a woman. And there's certain reasons why women who are born women are meant to do certain things and are to be in certain roles. And so, yeah, it's not okay. So I think there's a lot of messiness here. And I think that I saw in the past, but I obviously now I'm seeing it's been brewing for a long time. But I think a lot of the people who had identified as trans, they didn't want to mess with all that stuff. They didn't want to intrude. They knew things weren't really a woman, and they didn't want to get, intrude and push themselves into these spaces. And now with all this discourse, there's more people doing that. And I don't even know, there's the individuals that are taking advantage of course, but then there's all these people who think they're such good and open, accepting people for sort of allowing this to happen, or maybe even encouraging it to happen. And that's also a problem. So yeah, I mean, I think these are things that require a lot of discourse and conversation and back and forth. And, I hate to use the word nuance because now it's overused, but some nuance.
That was like my word of the year in 2020. Like my closest friends was like, stop. Yeah.
But I am more and more seeing more of the problems, and we can't just pretend that just because someone identifies as a thing, then now they're the thing, because they're not. You are there's reality. I actually just heard somebody, I won't name who, talk about this on their website, about how there's how you present and how the world sees you, and then there's how you see you. And you can't just, if you don't show the world that you're like this, you can't expect the world to accept you this way. So, they brought up some famous trans people like Blair White, for example. Like the world, she's presenting as a woman, so she will address her as a woman. Well, she's a woman, so they started to say she was a woman. I'm like, she's not a woman though, she's a trans woman. And she herself will say that she's a trans woman. There's a difference. She needs a different medical care than a woman, and so I'll say she's a she, but we know that she was not born a she. And there's what you see, you believe, what the world sees, and then there's just reality. So there's that part that I think sometimes get overlooked.
Is that all true to some extent for every individual?
What do you mean about what?
I mean, we each have our own ideas of who we are.
Yeah.
Right. Like our inner selves. And then there's how the world sees us.
Yeah, I guess that's true just about everything. I mean, this is weird for me. I see myself as a really shy, introverted person, but now I'm on podcasts. So.
Yeah. And actually that brings me to something else that's been on my mind. I've noticed in my networking and in my meetings of people who are relatively like-minded that those of us who are speaking out, the modern day dissidents, I would say quite a few that I've met are more introverted. I know you've told me you're quite introverted. I'm an INFJ, so introverted, intuitive, feeling, and judging, I will admit.
And I am, just to disclose, I'm an INFP. So what was P again? I know I'm a P. That's like
perceptive, I think.
Yeah. So that's probably makes sense why I ended up being a therapist.
Yeah. Are you noticing any personality traits or perhaps archetypes of modern day dissidents?
Yeah, I mean, and you've actually asked me that when we talked before, and I mean, I don't know, but it is interesting because we're not the ones. I think the ones that want the attention and like that admiration, and like Hollywood stars, for example, that are used to being in the spotlight and enjoy the spotlight, they don't want that negative stuff coming at them. So they're not the ones that are going to be going against the stream. And I think the people that are used to kind of maybe being on their own and having their own individual thought and maybe not as invested in what the group thinks are the ones that are stepping up. I think that, I don't know, that's just off the cuff what I've just noticed. I didn't do a research paper on it though.
Yeah, I mean, you are in the field of psychology, so that's also why I'm very curious about your perspective on this. And I've heard actually in that conversation between Weinstein and Matthias Desmet, and one of them or both of them mentioned the pattern of many of us saying, as we're advocating for individual liberties, for freedom, many of us will say then, because I don't feel like I have a choice. Yeah,
I felt that way. I really connected with that when they said that. That's what I remember that. I'd been silent on Facebook forever. And then I just felt like I had to say something, that Breonna Taylor was not in her bed, and like, stop with these lies. And this doesn't mean our whole country's racist. And I posted a video with Carol Swain, talking and really eloquently about these ideas. And I had a whole group of people who hadn't talked to me in 5 years, even though I had been posting that I had surgery and dropped out of life on disability. They all called me and thought my account was hacked. So anyway, I spoke. I just felt like I had to, and I knew that I didn't know to the level, but I knew that it was not the popular opinion, but I had to speak out. I had no choice. And as soon as I learned new information, I didn't have that ego where I had to hold on to, well, this is what I always said before, so I have to keep saying it. I was like, oh, I got new information, so now I'm going to change my tune and say what I've learned and share that. Interesting note though about COVID, I just want to share. You don't know this about me. I actually spent the first several months of the pandemic sewing masks. I sewed masks. I was obsessed with sewing masks, and I sold them for charity for this rare illnesses organization. And I was like posting pictures and posing with the masks. I sewed hundreds of masks. I really got good at it. And it was really, I was obsessed with it because I had nothing else to do with my life. And I was obviously very invested in these masks. Then I finally figured out the masks were completely useless. And I said, guess what? I'm done. So I could change course. And what I learned about people is that they weren't able to change course. They weren't able to learn new information and say, wait a second, even though I was really invested in this thing, actually I got new information and now I'm going to change my mind. I didn't know that was so unique.
No, and you also touched upon what sounds like an ego death too, or the process of letting go of your ego and changing your mind.
Yeah.
And like, as hard as it's been, so many gems have surfaced during this time, and in the form of people, and also just like the way, like the way people actually have come together. And I actually joke, because I do feel like we're all in this together, because we're all like, I think we've realized just how intertwined we are as people. And like libertarian folks will just get on that case about that, like as if the collective and the world just doesn't exist, like that we're just individuals.
No, we're humans. We're social creatures. Yeah.
Although, like, when I started this series, I was very focused on the individual, and I asked in the intro, what motivates someone to be brave in a time when it's quite controversial to step out as an individual? And I'm curious for you, like when you really look inward, what motivates you to be brave in the way that you are?
So yeah, it's funny how when people call me brave, I don't see it that way. I think I'm just being me. I think that's what it is. I think it's my temperament. And what's interesting is this is what I thought liberals were about, was like fighting against, things that they thought were wrong. And I basically had that liberal emotional energy, but then I learned what was really causing the problems, which is a lot of the things that liberals think are fixing the problems. And once I learned that stuff, then I wanted to, share it. And I actually believed people, at least closer in my life, would at least listen to me. And I've unfortunately learned that most of them won't. I've tried to have them, watch a video, or not my videos, but, documentaries or things that have taught me things. Or,
why not share one of your videos with a friend?
I mean, I guess I could. I gotta be honest. I got so railed on Facebook when I was first coming out about everything that I just withdrew from people in my life. And I actually originally started this Instagram page called Turned Red in 2020. And it was just my own personal journey of like all the new things I was learning about being a former leftist, and writing about, oh, well, wow, I didn't realize like actually guns are really important to help us with our safety. And actually, now that I see the government and cringing on my rights, which I've always never experienced before because I was always a free, spoiled American, now I get it. I never got what the Second Amendment and why it was important. I always thought those people were like kind of a little overboard, come on, guys. And now I'm like, I get it now. So I was just talking about all these different things that like I was learning, and I got this whole following, I think mostly of people who enjoyed watching me go through my process and learn things.
Yes, people love that, like the process of waking up, as some coin it. Yeah. As you bring up Second Amendment rights, I wanted to take this opportunity to share with you. I have this friend who's in therapy, and I swear to you, it's a friend and it's not me. I am also in therapy. I'll say that freely and proudly, but I'd like to do this friend some justice and just share her story. I'm going to read it because I want to make sure I get it right. And I'm really curious what you think was happening between her and her therapist, because this was just after the Uvalde shooting, and my friend was having some mixed feelings about, feeling very deeply empathetic toward the victims of that shooting, and then also being very concerned about our gun rights. So here goes. I have this friend who is looking to go back to her old therapist after having a fallout over differing views around vaccination and other issues, and not being able to voice her opinion in therapy. But she went back to her to give it another shot around the time when the gun restrictions were ramping up after the Uvalde shooting. She felt very deeply for the victims of that shooting, while at the same time felt concerned about the gun laws escalating, worried about the guns being taken away from lawful citizens and not the criminals who will likely break those laws. She had just listened to a lecture given by a woman named Kitty Worthman, who survived Nazi Germany. And Kitty warned, "Don't you ever let them take away your guns." The therapist said to my friend, "Well, that's just your opinion."
Yeah.
And I don't really want to get into politics. My friend replied, "I don't understand why you think that's an opinion. It's something I'm very fearful about." So here she was sharing her deepest, darkest fear.
Yeah.
And her therapist is like, "That's just your opinion. I don't really want to get into politics." And then my friend went back for one more session and expressed that the last straw was the therapist calling her deep fear just an opinion, implying that it wasn't worth talking about with such a callousness, like no empathy.
Yeah,
and here was my friend, like my friend, she has a bigger heart than I do. Like she was pouring her heart out. Like she felt so deeply about the shooting, and she felt so deeply about what could happen if some of our gun rights were taken away. Like she felt all of it across the board. She's pouring her heart out, and her therapist wasn't giving her anything, like wasn't giving her any empathy back. And when a client, so like, this is what I was wondering, like when a client expresses a fear like that, which is somewhat influenced by politics, what is the therapist's role? Like, is it to help the client?
Just explore.
Okay, yeah.
You don't even have to have the same opinion. That's what I don't understand about what's going on right now. I mean, I've always been sort of on the left, but it's not like I couldn't work with people on the right. I would explore with them about what, tell me what's the scariest for you. First of all, I would do a reflection and say, I could, from what you're saying, it sounds like there's a lot to be fearful of. Or I would probably ask her more about the lecture and what that woman said and how she felt while she was listening to it. I mean, just explore. The therapist doesn't need to agree. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing on a policy. This is just about the person's feelings, and that's what's missing here. And this is why I'm starting this program, because I'm writing this whole curriculum to basically help people recognize when a therapist is imposing their values onto you, they're not being a good therapist anymore. They're supposed to help you with what your values are and what you're going through. They're not supposed to just push their values onto you. And this therapist obviously had a huge blind spot. Obviously, this therapist, what they really wanted to say was, you're being ignorant, and we need to take the guns away so we can save all these kids. That's my inference of what that therapist was thinking. I guess I don't know exactly, but it sounds like that therapist disagreed with, believed gun control was a solution. So, but she didn't want to say that outright. So I think she thought she was being understanding by not confronting that person, but instead she completely missed what her client was going through, the fears. I mean, I honestly, I'm glad you found a good therapist, because I actually didn't. Especially last year when I was going through the grief and loss. I mean, I went through so much grief and loss from having a disability. I did see a therapist for a little bit then, and that was somewhat helpful. But then I honestly, I didn't have enough of a diagnosis to keep going, because insurance wouldn't pay for it. But then I was willing to pay out of pocket. And especially, I finally got back to life. I thought life was going to get better. And I mean, it did get better in a lot of ways, but I thought I was going to get back to my life and the way it was before. And then obviously all the shutdowns happened, and then I lost my job, and my family really wasn't very supportive, or just didn't really listen. And so I tried to find a therapist to explore all those things, but it was impossible, because I felt like I had to self-censor. And, the whole thing is, if I tell a therapist I don't feel comfortable here because people are judging me for making my own medical decisions, and then I have a therapist saying you need to wear your mask and get your vaccine, which I've heard a lot of other people go through, then I think that's terrible therapy. Yeah, I just don't understand. Yeah. You could even disagree. You could think that the person should get the vaccine, but that's irrelevant. It's about what the person's going through. Nobody knew the answer. For a while, nobody knew what was the right thing, because nobody knew it was a new thing. So the truth is, anybody's opinion on it was an opinion. So it's not like you can say, there's certain things I think you could say with a little more authority. If someone is, driving drunk and doing really destructive behaviors to the point where they've put their life on the line, that you can have an opinion that this is dangerous and try to guide that person from making really destructive choices. But these kinds of topics are not the same thing, so exploring with a person what they're going through and maybe why they came to those conclusions, and helping them make their own choices, that's what a therapist is supposed to do.
Yeah, I did get the sense that there was some dehumanization happening in that interaction as she was telling me about it, because it was like she wasn't seen as a full human being, and instead was just seen as like a political pawn, perhaps. Like it wasn't really, like it turned into something that wasn't really therapy. And also, as I understand, just from like my limited perspective, like therapists and psychiatrists are trained to treat patients who are way more different and perhaps delusional, like just completely like outside of our reality. So if someone can't like meet a client in a situation like this over, concerns about violence and gun rights, which she had concerns about both. She actually has a very balanced perspective, as do I actually. But if a therapist can't meet her there, then would that therapist be able to like meet someone with schizophrenia who really needs help getting grounded? Who knows? But these are questions that come up. I
mean, I think that this therapist had a blind spot. My guess is what happened was, when this client brought this up, the therapist had an emotional gut reaction, and that got in the way of the therapist being able to have an empathetic response. And so what a good therapist does is they are able to notice they're having these feelings inside of them, and take a moment and kind of process that for themselves and say, oh my gosh, like this is bringing up some stuff for me. And now I'm worried that this person is about enabling kids to get killed in schools or something, right? But a therapist that has a good self-reflection will be able to notice that and say, this isn't about that. This is about this person and their feelings, and I'm here to sit with them and their feelings. And I'm going to put my feelings aside at the moment and work with them and be present. So I think what happened was this therapist was not able to be present with the person. And their feelings got in the way. They probably, it was, the news and everything, was really reactive and emotional. And probably this therapist was watching that, or maybe saw their friends on social media whatever they were seeing. And I think it just blinded them to be able to work with this person. Maybe this therapist is good in other scenarios, but in that moment they had a blind spot. And you know, a really good skilled therapist can know, you know, oh God, like I have this hot button and this person just hit it. And that can be true for everything, not just politics. You know, it could bring up something that reminds you of your dad, and oh God, that they're talking about, like, now it's like my dad, and then you start treating them like they're you, and you're like, this person is this injured child that you still feel inside. That's why therapists need to really work their shit out because they easily can project onto their clients and get in the way.
Right.
And it's happening more and more with the politics, but that's something that therapists, we were always trained to do, is to, first of all, that's why most therapy programs are required to have your own therapy to be a therapist. And sometimes I guess now it's maybe not so useful because the therapist that therapy they're getting may not be so great. I don't know. It's cyclical. But it's about having that insight. I mean, what that therapist could do to repair that is maybe in the moment they got emotional, they got rash. If maybe if they were a good person, because we're all human, they could have come out of that session and said to themselves, oh gosh, I realized I just got my politics got in the way of the session, and come back and disclose to their client and said, I realized that my opinions got in the way of helping you explore what you were going through. And they can apologize and say, I'm sorry, or just acknowledge that, and then say, I'd really like to hear what you're going through. And that's what a good therapist would do, because nobody's perfect, right? Because there are moments where it does get in your way. And when good therapists often have a consultation group or somebody to consult with and say, I don't think the session went well, what got in the way? And then oftentimes a colleague will help them kind of explore what got in the way, or maybe other angles to look at it, or, you know, help them figure out what the dynamic was. So
I will say in one of my therapy sessions personally, I was given the advice to try not to cancel people on an individual level. So of course we see canceling like en masse and publicly, but like to avoid just saying, I can't interact with this person, I'm done. And like that also brings to mind, like within the context of client therapist interactions, like maybe it's not canceling, but maybe a client and a therapist just aren't a good fit.
Yeah.
And when can you, like, how could you tell like that you're just not a good fit with a therapist? And like, what would the difference between like a red flag and just not being a good fit be?
Well, I actually did. It's actually up on my website right now, which is www.thetruthfultherapist.org. I actually have a little video up for free that has red flags in therapy, but I'll name a few here that I could think of off the cuff. I mean, the red flags are when someone does something sort of unethical or really gets in the way of therapy, not just something that's just not a nice relational thing, but for example, if boundaries are off, you know, if the therapist is trying to be your best friend, if they're disclosing too much of their own personal information and not really being there for you in the session, I'd say that's a red flag. With kids, if the therapist is, you know, not excluding the parents too much, that's a red flag, especially if the parents want to be involved. If they say, no, you can't do that, or your kid will kill themselves if I bring you into session or something, that's a red flag. I'm trying to think now. I mean, the red flags are when someone does something, you know, unethical, right? Says something, you know, sexual, hits on the client, right? That's a red flag. And now I'm blanking on all the red flags. There's so many.
Yeah,
I did a whole video on it.
People should just go to that video.